Baby Driver, which is this high-octane action comedy set to music. Is this movie like an editor's dream, or is it like an editor's nightmare?
Well, I'd say it's a dream, personally.
There you go.
I mean, we worked with Edgar a couple of times, or Paul's worked with him 3 times. So I've actually worked with him 3 times. And every single time you come to work in the morning, there's almost an anticipation of seeing the rushes, because you know that there's going to be something extraordinary. I mean, he's just a visual genius, Edgar, and he thinks about film in a way which no other director that I can really think of thinks about it. The amount of thought and planning, the way that music and sound is integrated with the film, so much of this is actually in his head during the writing process. And I think, all of that really is exemplified in Baby Driver.
Well, one of the things that the movie does really well is that it sets so much of it to music. The music is such an integral part of it, as you said, as it is in all of Edgar Wright's movies. But in this one particularly, it really drives the narrative and drives the action sequences. So can you guys talk a bit about editing to this music?
Well, yes. I mean, this was certainly, the original concept, which Edgar almost 10 years ago, when he sort of thought of this and started writing the script, it was always going to be about the music and just about how the action and indeed the dialogue and just about every aspect of the film is integrated to the music. And of course, it's very easy for a person to sit and write the script and say, hey, I'd love to have this happen here, and this should happen here, and this should happen here. But actually, when you stop and think, okay, how do we kind of practically achieve a lot of this? And of course, one sort of major kind of rule, I suppose, that was said was that we didn't rely a lot on CG. So we couldn't sort of go, well, we could sort of fix it afterwards, or, because we shot very, very little on green screen for this film. So a lot of it was practical. A lot of it sort of had to happen the way it had to happen in terms of on the beat, on the rhythm. And of course, you were there to make sure that that process was seamless, really, that all these shots, and there were hundreds and hundreds of shots, it's certainly in some of the action sequences, that everything lined up to the bar, to the quarter bar, to the downbeat. You were aware of everything, rather than just putting an action sequence together. You would put an action sequence together, relevant to where the music was or where the music had to be. So you always actually had something in the background that was, the heartbeat of the sequence. You couldn't just sort of put it together and go, hey, that works really well. It always had to be in respect of what the music was doing and where the action needed to be, relevant to where the music was. So that was a challenge.
The movie also has a lot of humor in it, as do all of Edgar Wright's movies. This one is really quick and snappy. Can you talk about editorially keeping the movie quick, keeping it snappy, keeping the comedy going?
Well, I would say that you always want to keep those sort of balls in the air, really, and I think there's a nice balance to achieve between not just cutting fast to keep comedy fast, to keep action fast, because a lot of actors have, especially good comedy actors like Jamie Foxx, they will bring their own timing, and you don't want to just sort of cut fast at the risk of losing what they bring to the table. And so, it's a combination of keeping, obviously the action has to be fast, but the comedy can be, comedy can be tight. I mean, the dialogue's very punchy. I mean, Edgar's, there's very little fat on this script, so to speak. The lines, I mean, every line has a purpose, and every line, every scene helps drive the film on in terms of giving you extra information, throwing jokes in there, and it's, there's always just that balance of having all those things happen, keeping it punchy, but keeping it natural, not feeling like it's really editing that's driving it. And I think that's the secret still, is to keep it, to feel like it's happening and unfolding the way you're viewing it. Really.
There's a lot of really great car chase sequences in the film, including at the very beginning. Talk a bit about that very first car chase scene, because it does so much to establish the tone of the movie, the style of the movie. Talk about putting that sequence together.
John?
Well, I mean, first of all, that sequence was, like a lot of the sequences, there was a lot of planning that goes into creating it. So it was, there's some previs and things were, already quite tightly choreographed to the track. The track would have, I think for that one, there's almost 13 parts to it. And each section of action would have to happen within a certain time restriction effectively. So you're trying to kind of compress the story and the action into small segments. So in some ways that's kind of quite helpful because you have a certain degree of restriction and you can't go beyond a certain point. But in other respects, it's a drawback because you're trying to compress huge amount of information into a very limited space of time. So, it led to the thing. There were certain parts of that which we felt we couldn't fit in, which eventually through the process of editing, of fine cutting and, reducing things down, we managed to make them fit. But it was a very complicated thing to get right. And with the previs, for instance, the previs and the stunt viz, that gives you a sense of how the cars are going to move through the spaces, but it doesn't really take into consideration the characters and how they're going to respond to, Baby as the central protagonist of the story. And I think the key thing with that particular sequence is it's about Baby and about them being blown away by Baby, the driver, and trying to building that characterization into the very restricted structure was a kind of one of the key problems, I think, and something I think we overcame because I think that comes through very strongly. In terms of the syncopation, there's lots of things people often say is it's cut to the beat. I don't think it is always cut to the beat. A lot of the time in the film we're cutting kind of it's either there's moments where the characters might sway or move in the frame and you're finding kind of other rhythms within the images rather than strictly cutting something to the beat. So I think that's the extra layers of syncopation we could kind of bring into it through editing, which give it such a unique feel, I think.
Yeah, because I think that's the thing. We're also, I mean, yes, it's an exciting car chase, but we're also selling a concept to the audience as well. We're sort of saying this is why this film is going to be a little bit different from other films of maybe similar types, because you almost have to kind of and that's why the beginning, before it all hell breaks loose, it's sort of designed to sort of get the audience used to going, when you hear this happens, and there is an initial idea of syncopation, and really we had to, if the audience didn't really buy that what was going on with bell bottoms, we probably wouldn't have had much luck with the rest of the film, selling it to them as a film that mixes these types of music and picture styles together. And so, and of course, it was the track that Edgar had in his head 10 years earlier, even longer, thought, what a great track to start a film, and maybe to have a heist and a bank robbery in there as well. And so it did a lot of things. It had to be a great scene in its own right, and it had to be a scene which laid, set the film stall out, basically saying, you're going to watch something a little different here, and hopefully you will get what's going on. And actually, from the beginning, the audience got it. I think any fears that may have been had, but maybe it's a little bit tricky, will the two work together? I think from even the first sort of premiere screening we had in Austin, the audience got it right away, and we knew from the moment the bell bottoms played that they got it, and and they stuck with it for the rest of the film, which was great.
The other standout sequence in the movie I wanted to ask you guys about is the climactic heist gone wrong that is the whole movie is building towards. It's a really complicated action sequence with shootouts and car chases, lots of different geographies, Baby running all over the place. Can you talk about putting that sequence together so that it made sense and was exciting?
Yes, well, that was indeed, as you say, a complicated sequence to put together. I mean, it's a very ambitious piece because it's trying to do several things as well as just being a kind of a standard kind of almost like hide and seek piece with cars. That also went through a number of permutations, and I mean, we're very, very pleased with the end result, and I think you know it was a complicated shoot. There were a lot of elements going on. I mean, there were some shots where we actually had some stun shots where I think we had 9 or 10 cameras running for coverage for the one stunt. So there were a lot of options. It wasn't just kind of A, B, C, D, E, put these shots together and hope they work. There were multiple ways of telling the story, and you know, the final version, I think, is great, and it had to go through. It went through changes as you normally do through preview screenings. We thought we could, you know, embellish the ending a little bit better, which is what we did on a subsequent bit of additional photography. But it was a very big challenge because, in actual fact, you have at the end of the day, you also have this track, this Queen track, which is very specific in its kind of musical progression. And so, you know, you can't just cut a sequence down or just sort of say, I'll shave 2 frames off this, or, you know, make that 6 frames longer, because of course it will just fall out of sync and the music is unforgiving. You know, you can't just extend, you know, a bar of music by 6 frames to sort of make that fit. So you always have to make an edit, and then you have to say, well, what's going on around it? How do I then, maybe I need to tweak what's around it so I get back to a certain point at a certain time, which I need to be at. You know, there's a lot of anchor points, and maybe in between there are little bits you can change, but it's a very finite adjustment, really, and very easy for it to sort of not quite unravel, but for you to sort of go, oh, I need to make sure I'm sitting on that kind of, you know, metronomic part of the song, or when the guitar slows down or the drums pull out and you're into that kind of solo guitar bit. The action had to be at a certain point, and it had to be ready for a particular car crash to happen on a particular guitar note. And if someone's sort of saying, that's great, now can you do that in about, you know, can we make that a little bit 10 seconds shorter? So to go, yes, I sort of can. And then you sort of think, well, and then you think about every other element plays in respect of it. So that there was a challenge, and probably the sequence it took the longest to get to where it is now. Would you agree, John?
I certainly would. Yeah, that sequence was a tough thing to get right, and I think, you know, it's the build-up before that. I guess your question really relates not just to the ending, but also to the bit where Bats gets killed and the whole chase. I mean, I think Edgar's dream with that scene was always to kind of try and replicate the foot chase from Point Break, which, you know, if I think back to Hot Fuzz, Point Break was the reference for, you know, some of the foot chase in Hot Fuzz, and in a way, Baby Driver became the ultimate foot chase for Edgar. And I think that sequence really, you know, the tailspin of Baby, how his life begins to fall apart, really begins at that. Well, it's begun earlier, but that's really, you know, the point where John Hamm's character reveals himself, and the film itself completely kind of, I think the ominous mood which has been building, that finally reveals itself, and the film changes thereafter. It introduces a lot of, for me, some of the more interesting musical scenes as well, like the diner, where, you know, that scene was quite interesting to put together, just to try and kind of keep the tension through that scene. There's quite a lot of coverage for it, but then, you know, you're again, as Paul was saying, you're anchored to certain moments. You know, that scene always had to be the duration it was, because we generally didn't want to edit the tracks down. We kind of wanted to let the tracks live, you know, to be the duration that they were originally, and we would always try and make our action exist within, you know, the original track.
There's a lot of quieter sequences in the movie as well. Scenes of romance, scenes of baby's life at home and his past. Can you talk about putting together those sequences in a movie that it has so much high octane action in it?
Well, I think it's great in a film of this nature that it actually has these wonderful dynamics in it as well. And, you can still slow a film right down, but still keep the tension bubbling away, especially when you've given, when you've got great dialogue and then great actors saying that dialogue as well. And in many ways it's there are complications and tricks in trying to put those together, because you're dealing with when various story points and characters meet, and the interactions and the subtleties that they're all offering up as well. You want to include all of that. There are important story beats in those scenes. The building of the relationship with Baby and Deborah, and there's other scenes in the diner where you realize that Bats, Jamie's character, is actually a full-blown lunatic, and they're dealing with a very live wire, but there's sort of other things going on as well. Plus, there is the other conceit that there is always, in fact, even in all those scenes, there is music going on, and the music also, is actually, if you listen even to the songs that Edgar's chosen, they're actually also informing what's going on in the story. They're all subtle references. That they're more than just a nice song to have at that point, but that every song means something. And even in those quiet dialogue scenes where you feel like, well, it's not actually cutting to the beat anymore, and this is sort of being played out, and we're a little bit looser, there's actually lots of things still going on underneath. Sound effects. I mean, famously, of course, in the restaurant scene in The Godfather, which is something that as a kid, growing up and editing, all those things you remember. And of course, Edgar takes that kind of stuff on board to a huge extent. So actually cutting those scenes can be, as tricky, as interesting, and as layered as well as the sort of fast-paced stuff. And that's the great thing, though, about the way Edgar's approach to all those kind of scenes work, is there's always stuff going on a lot of different levels.
Well, Paul and Jonathan, thank you so much. Congratulations on the movie. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Cheers.
Thank you.